The chamber was tense the moment Jasmine Crockett stepped up to the microphone. Clarence Thomas had been sitting in silence for most of the session, but when he finally spoke, his dismissive tone sent a ripple of unease across the room. He underestimated her, something many had done before, but Crockett was not one to back down. She straightened her notes, looked him dead in the eye, and delivered one sharp line that cut through the air like a blade. The audience gasped, the crowd behind her erupted, and for a brief moment Thomas was left speechless. It was a blow not of fists, but of words, precise, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of his reaction. But then, Thomas shifted in his seat. Instead of retreating, he leaned forward, adjusted his glasses, and raised his hand. The murmurs in the room grew louder as he requested to respond. What followed stunned everyone. He tried to regain control, offering a counter-statement meant to reassert his authority. Yet the more he spoke, the more it became clear, Crockett had already dismantled the foundation of his argument. His words wavered, his tone faltered, and even his allies avoided his gaze. Crockett, calm and steady, simply folded her hands and let the silence of the room do the work. She didn't need to say another word, the crowd had already decided who had won. By the time the session ended, clips of her striking line were already spreading across social media. Commentators labeled it the moment that shifted the entire debate. Thomas had done something, yes, he tried to recover, tried to defend, but his reaction only highlighted the strength of her attack. And Jasmine Crockett? She walked out of that chamber with her head high, knowing she had just written another viral chapter in her growing legacy. The next morning, the confrontation was the headline everywhere. News outlets replayed the clip of Jasmine Crockett's sharp retort on a loop, dissecting every word. Analysts pointed out how swiftly she turned Thomas's dismissive remark into an opening for herself, a tactical move few could have executed with such precision. Meanwhile, Clarence Thomas found himself at the center of a storm he hadn't anticipated. His allies tried to downplay the exchange, but reporters pressed him with relentless questions. Every attempt he made to explain or defend his comments only added fuel to the fire. It was no longer just about what he said, it was about how decisively Crockett had silenced him in public. Inside Congress, staffers whispered about the shift in momentum. Crockett's voice, once underestimated, was now seen as the defining tone of the debate. Her calm confidence in the face of a powerful opponent had turned her into a symbol of defiance. And as for Thomas, the more he pushed back, the clearer it became, his reaction was less about principle and more about pride. The crowd had seen the exchange live, unfiltered, and there was no undoing the impression it left. Crockett hadn't just won an argument, she had taken command of the narrative. By the third day, the moment had grown far beyond the walls of Congress. Talk shows replayed Crockett's line with dramatic emphasis, commentators praising her poise while audiences cheered in agreement. Hashtags carrying her name trended across platforms, while memes showcasing Thomas's stunned expression spread faster than his team could contain. Behind the scenes, Thomas's advisors urged him to remain quiet, warning that every new response only made things worse. But silence did not come easily to him. The weight of being publicly outmaneuvered gnawed at his pride. He prepared statements, tried drafting op-eds, yet each draft read like a defensive excuse rather than a confident rebuttal. Crockett, on the other hand, stayed silent by choice. She didn't flood the airwaves, didn't chase interviews. Instead, she allowed her one decisive moment to echo freely. The restraint only made her seem more powerful, she didn't need to fight for the spotlight found her. And when reporters cornered her in the hallway, she simply smiled and said, "The people saw what happened. They'll decide what it meant." That single sentence poured gasoline on the fire, reminding everyone that her blow hadn't just been against Thomas, it had been a strike for accountability itself. The pressure on Clarence Thomas finally reached a breaking point. After days of silence, he scheduled a televised statement, determined to reclaim his authority. His team set up the backdrop, flags neatly placed, lighting perfect, everything designed to project strength. As the cameras went live, Thomas delivered his carefully rehearsed defense. He spoke of experience, tradition, and the importance of his perspective. But instead of calming the storm, his words felt hollow. Commentators noted how often he stumbled, how his tone shifted from defensive to frustrated. Meanwhile, Crockett's supporters gathered online, watching every second with anticipation. When the clip hit social media, it didn't land the way Thomas hoped. Instead of reinforcing his image, it sparked new waves of ridicule. Viewers pointed out the contrast, his lengthy speech versus Crockett's single, razor-sharp line that had already carried the day. In the halls of Congress, whispers grew louder. Thomas had overplayed his hand. His attempt to strike back only reminded everyone of how he had been outmaneuvered in the first place. Crockett didn't even need to respond. She let his televised effort unravel on its own, proof that sometimes the strongest counter is silence. When the chamber convened again, all eyes shifted to Jasmine Crockett. Everyone knew Clarence Thomas had tried to steady himself with his televised statement, but the room buzzed with curiosity. Would Crockett address it directly? She stood, calm as ever, and adjusted the microphone. Instead of attacking his words head-on, she chose a different path. With measured composure, she spoke about integrity, responsibility, and the duty leaders owed to the people who placed their trust in them. Not once did she mention Thomas by name, yet every sentence carried the weight of their clash. The effect was electric. By avoiding personal jabs and focusing on principle, she positioned herself above the fray. The crowd leaned in, reporters scribbled furiously, and even her critics found themselves unable to dismiss the strength in her delivery. Thomas sat motionless, unable to interrupt. Each phrase was another reminder that she didn't need to trade barbs, she had already won the moral ground. When she ended with, "The truth doesn't need to be defended, it stands on its own," the chamber erupted with applause. The cameras caught Thomas lowering his gaze, his silence louder than any rebuttal. The message was clear: Crockett hadn't just won an argument, she had defined the standard. Outside the chamber, the reaction was immediate. Clips of Jasmine Crockett's words flooded every platform, racking up millions of views in hours. Commentators on both sides admitted one thing: she had struck a chord that was impossible to ignore. Her decision not to even name Thomas while dismantling his argument elevated her far above the noise. Crowds gathered outside the Capitol holding signs with her closing line. Editorials praised her discipline, noting how rare it was for a politician to resist the temptation of direct confrontation and instead let principles speak louder. Her restraint had become her greatest weapon. Meanwhile, Thomas's team scrambled. The silence of the chamber replayed endlessly, his bowed head juxtaposed against Crockett's steady gaze. Every attempt to spin the narrative fell flat. Public opinion shifted, not because of what Thomas said, but because of what he couldn't say. In just a week, Crockett transformed from a rising voice to a national figurehead. Invitations poured in for interviews, keynote speeches, and televised appearances. Yet she turned down most of them, choosing only the moments that mattered. The public saw her not as someone chasing the spotlight, but as someone commanding it. And for Thomas, the damage was done. His silence, once a tool of power, had been turned into a symbol of defeat. After days of silence, Jasmine Crockett finally agreed to one interview. The network billed it as the conversation everyone had been waiting for. The studio lights glared, the audience sat in hushed anticipation, and millions tuned in live. The interviewer wasted no time, cutting straight to the clash with Clarence Thomas. "Do you think your words went too far?" they asked, hoping to provoke a defensive answer. But Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned forward, calm but firm, and replied, "The truth has no volume setting. Sometimes it's whispered, sometimes it thunders, but it never apologizes for being real." The audience erupted with applause. Even the interviewer, momentarily caught off guard, paused before continuing. Crockett then pivoted, steering the conversation away from personalities and toward the broader issues at stake. She reminded viewers that the debate was never about her or Thomas alone, it was about accountability, transparency, and respect for the public. Clips of her answer spread instantly, but this time it wasn't just her supporters sharing them. Neutral commentators called it one of the most disciplined political interviews in years. By staying composed while doubling down on principle, Crockett had done what Thomas couldn't. She owned the moment without letting it own her. By the end of the broadcast, it was clear, the debate was finished, and Crockett had won it on her terms. Behind closed doors, Clarence Thomas's frustration reached a breaking point. Reports leaked from his inner circle describing heated meetings where he vented about the media, about Crockett, and even about his own advisors. Every attempt to push back had failed, and the more he tried, the stronger she seemed to become. One aide recalled him slamming a folder shut and muttering, "She turned one line into an empire." The frustration wasn't just about being challenged, it was about losing control of the narrative, something he had held tightly for years. Meanwhile, Crockett's quiet rise continued. Her measured tone in the interview won her praise from unlikely corners, with even critics admitting she handled herself with an authority few could match. She was invited to town halls, panels, and policy roundtables, not as a guest, but as the central voice. The contrast couldn't have been sharper, Thomas struggling in private, while Crockett thrived in public. And what made it worse for him was that she never even mentioned his name again. By refusing to acknowledge him, she made him appear smaller, as though the battle had ended and only he hadn't realized it. In the court of public opinion, silence had once been his weapon. Now, it was her strategy, and it was working. The ripple effects of Jasmine Crockett's clash with Clarence Thomas finally reached the policy arena. What began as a fiery exchange had now turned into momentum for real legislative movement. Committees that once overlooked her proposals began granting her more time, more attention, and, for the first time, genuine bipartisan support. Her colleagues whispered in the halls that Crockett had become the voice no one could afford to ignore. Bills she had introduced months earlier, once stalled in endless debate, were suddenly gaining traction. The public pressure created by her viral moment pushed leaders to reconsider their stances. At the same time, Clarence Thomas's standing weakened. Each time his name surfaced in relation to the incident, it was framed as part of a larger decline. His allies, once quick to defend him, began quietly shifting away, careful not to tie themselves to a losing narrative. Crockett, however, kept her focus steady. She reminded her supporters that victory wasn't about humiliating an opponent, it was about turning words into action. The real blow, she said in a committee hearing, isn't a line that goes viral. It's when the people finally see results. Those words resonated deeply, and for the first time, her opponents realized this was no longer a battle of egos, it was the start of a movement. What had started as a viral exchange in Congress now spilled into the streets. Jasmine Crockett's name began appearing on signs, banners, and even T-shirts at rallies across the country. People who had never paid attention to politics were suddenly quoting her lines, repeating her words as if they were slogans for change. When she traveled to speak at a university town hall, the venue overflowed. Students crowded the hallways, chanting her name, while cameras streamed the event live to hundreds of thousands online. Her calm but uncompromising message resonated with younger audiences, many of whom felt their voices had long been ignored. Meanwhile, Clarence Thomas grew increasingly isolated. His once commanding presence now seemed diminished, overshadowed by Crockett's surge in popularity. The more her influence spread, the more his silence weighed against him. His name became a footnote in stories that now centered entirely on her. During one rally, Crockett stood before a massive crowd holding candles and said, "It's not about me, it's about us. One voice can spark a fire, but it's the people who keep it burning." The crowd roared, and that clip became the most shared video of the week. Her movement had outgrown the chamber, it was now a national force. Clarence Thomas could no longer stand watching Jasmine Crockett's influence expand unchecked. Against the advice of his closest aides, he agreed to appear at a high-profile public forum, determined to reclaim his authority. The stage was set, cameras ready, and the event was broadcast live nationwide. When his turn came, Thomas launched into a forceful speech, warning against what he framed as grandstanding and soundbite politics. He spoke with passion, but his words carried a bitterness that was hard to ignore. The audience sat politely, yet the energy in the room was muted, no spark, no applause, just strained silence. Then, in the middle of his remarks, a reporter stood up and asked the question that cut through everything: if your argument is so strong, why did a single sentence from Representative Crockett silence the chamber while you've needed days to respond? The question hung in the air like a hammer. Thomas froze for a fraction of a second, visibly thrown off. His answer was long and defensive, but the damage was done. Clips of the moment spread instantly, reinforcing the very perception he was trying to fight. Meanwhile, Crockett didn't even acknowledge the forum. Her silence was louder than his speech, reminding everyone that sometimes the most devastating blow is refusing to swing at all. As Clarence Thomas's forum appearance unraveled across headlines, something new began happening on Capitol Hill. Jasmine Crockett's allies started stepping forward. Representatives who had once kept their distance now openly praised her courage. Senators referenced her words during hearings. Even longtime skeptics admitted privately that she had shifted the balance of influence. In one press conference, a colleague declared, "What Representative Crockett did wasn't just about winning an exchange, it was about redefining what leadership looks like." The statement drew cheers, and the clip circulated almost as widely as Crockett's original line. Behind the scenes, her staff noticed a surge of collaboration. Lawmakers were calling her office, seeking to co-sponsor bills or align on policy. She had become a magnet for momentum, not because she chased the spotlight, but because she embodied discipline and principle when others faltered. Thomas, meanwhile, found his allies retreating. One by one, they shifted their focus, careful not to be caught defending a losing battle. The silence surrounding him grew heavier, the chamber colder. For Crockett, it was no longer about Clarence Thomas at all. The blow she had struck weeks earlier had expanded into something larger, a movement with her name tied to it. And her allies were ready to carry that movement even further. By the time the dust settled, Jasmine Crockett's moment against Clarence Thomas had become more than just a viral clip, it was etched into political history. Commentators began comparing it to the great turning points of past debates, the kind of instant that defined not only a career, but an era. Her name carried weight across the country. Crowds still repeated her words, lawmakers still echoed her principles, and young leaders pointed to her as proof that one voice, delivered with clarity and conviction, could change the course of a debate. Thomas, once the towering figure in the conversation, faded quietly into the background. His efforts to recover were remembered less for their content and more for how they highlighted the strength of Crockett's single blow. His silence became the final chapter of his part in the story, while hers became the opening chapter of something larger. In an interview months later, Crockett reflected on the moment. "It wasn't about me," she said softly. "It was about showing that truth still matters, even when the odds say you should stay silent. One line can open a door, but it's the people who walk through it that make change real." And with that, history had its verdict. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument, she transformed it into a legacy. Months later, the moment still echoed. Universities taught it in political science courses, analyzing how Jasmine Crockett's single line shifted the balance of power. News outlets replayed the exchange whenever discussions of accountability arose. And at rallies across the nation, her words remained a chant for those demanding change. Crockett herself, however, refused to let the moment define her alone. She poured her newfound influence into building coalitions, drafting policies, and amplifying voices that were often ignored. Each time she stood at a podium, she reminded audiences that it wasn't about celebrity, it was about responsibility. As for Clarence Thomas, his silence had become his legacy. Once feared for his authority, he was now remembered for being outmaneuvered in public view. His final attempts at rebuttal were footnotes. What endured was the image of him left speechless as Crockett stood unwavering before him. The story closed not with drama, but with clarity. Crockett had proven that strength wasn't measured in how loud one shouted, but in how firmly one stood. Her blow had landed, but it was the movement she sparked that carried forward. In the end, history would not mark that day as the fall of one man, but as the rise of a leader whose voice could not be silenced.